Hello, hello. This is Justin Colletti, and welcome. Today, we are going to be looking at some budget studio monitors that are $500 or under a pair that have arguably some of the best low end in their price point. And not just their price point, but price points much higher. But because every time I look at a product on this channel, I end up doing something like of a little history lesson and a little mixing lesson. We're going to explore some principles that are going to be interesting, even if you're not shopping for new speakers. But in case you are, I wanted to highlight the Gauss 7 studio monitors from Avantone because they're a little bit of a sleeper, and I wasn't aware of them when I did a recent roundup of the best studio monitors for $500 and under. In case you haven't checked that out, you can find it right here on this channel where I went through, I want to say, the top 6 most popular studio monitors and gave you my exact tasting notes on each of them and which ones I'd recommend for who, all in that $500 and under price range. And one of the comments came in asking, what do you think of the Gauss 7s? They're $500 and under. And I said, you know what? I have never heard them. I've seen them twice in person. I didn't listen to them because they were at trade shows. The guy who helped design them, a guy named Seth Berman, gave me a spiel about them, but I never heard them and I haven't seen them that much. And after these comments, I reached out to my friend Seth over at Avantone and RAD Distribution. I asked him, can you send me a pair of these so I can hear them? Because I've got to know them. If in case you don't know Avantone, they are extremely famous for making the reissues of the Yamaha NS10 speakers and the Avantone Pro Mix Cubes, which are a remake of the Oratones. So they have their CLA10 monitors they're famous for, and their Avantone Mix Cubes, both great studio monitors that serve a purpose that is not filled by most brands making studio monitors. So I had to check these out and find out who they're good for, what is good about them, who's going to like them, and who's not going to like them. And I will absolutely say that there are studio monitors in this price point that are very popular, that these are way better than in pretty much every way that a speaker can be better. But I'm going to give you not only the sense of what's great for them, about them, but also the potential cons and who might not be best served by these monitors. All right, the first thing I want to say about these Gausses is that compared to everything else in this price bracket of 500 and under that we've looked at, these are big. These monitors have a 7-inch driver in them, hence Gauss 7. And most of the monitors we were looking at in my big roundup of speakers for 500 and under had 5-inch drivers. So this one is an outlier at $500 having a 7-inch driver and going surprisingly deep. Another way it's a bit of an outlier, it's one of only 2 speakers that have what's called an AMT tweeter, a corrugated, what some people call a ribbon tweeter. And we'll talk about the advantages and disadvantages there. These speakers, I've got to say, if you want a pair of white-coned full-range speakers, in my opinion, almost everyone who is looking at the Yamaha HS series of monitors, my personal extremely biased opinion, would be better served by these Gauss 7 monitors. There are some people who would be better served by other monitors, and I'll talk about why, but I first want to talk about what these things get great. And that is that they have easily the cleanest, tightest sounding low end I've heard in speakers at this price point. So they arguably have some of the best bass in this price point. But best bass, what does that even mean, man? Is best bass the most bass? Is best bass the flattest bass? Is best bass the deepest bass? There are different ways that we can say speakers have good low end. And these speakers have good low end in a way that we don't find in other speakers in this price point. And the way in which they have some of the best low end in this price point, 2 ways they excel. Number 1, extremely low distortion in the low end. A lot of budget speakers end up having a substantial amount of distortion, particularly in the lows. Even if the speaker overall measures as having relatively low distortion, when you look at all of the frequencies, when you just zero in on the lows, that's where they end up having the most distortion. And they actually use the distortion in the low end to help give you an impression of having even more bass. These, the Gauss 7s, relative to their competition, don't do that. They have much cleaner bass. So what's the plus about having cleaner bass versus dirtier bass? Well, quick little physics lesson here. If you're reproducing a tone at, say, 60 hertz, and there's distortion on that tone, it means you're not only reproducing 60 hertz, you're also reproducing 60 hertz above that, 120 hertz, and also 180 hertz, and also 240 hertz. These harmonics, this harmonic saturation is getting added above your main fundamental frequency. So the more that you have distortion when you play, say, a 60 hertz tone, the more that you're also going to hear amplified frequencies like 120 and 180 and 240 and 300. And sometimes when we find inexpensive speakers that seem like they have good low frequency reproduction, they sound really full and big in the bottom, it's not just the low end we're hearing. It's the distortion on the low end into the low mid frequencies that we might be getting a sense for this additional fatness and richness in the speaker if they are high enough distortion in the lows. And these are remarkably clean in the lows. So that is one way in which they're potentially better from an objective perspective. But we'll talk about how that translates into actual mix decisions you might be making and how that could help you get better mixes. Because ultimately, when we're looking to studio monitors, the point is to get better sounding mixes. It's not even to like your studio monitors. Honestly, if you get studio monitors that you don't really like that much, but they make you have great mixes, that's better than having studio monitors you really like and your mixes are terrible, which there's a surprising number of people out there. Sometimes I'm critical of some models of studio monitors, and I will be critical of some models of studio monitors in this episode. Sometimes I hear from people who say, oh man, my mixes, they just don't translate. I take them out of the car, they sound terrible. There's just like this professional sheen that's not there. But I love my studio monitors, they sound great. Wouldn't it be better if you had studio monitors you didn't think were great, but your mixes were great? Isn't that the goal? Anyway, I digress, but that idea is important. The second way that these guys have really good low end and potentially better than the competition is that the low end here is extremely fast. So these white cone tweeters may look familiar because they're made famous originally by the Yamaha NS10s, and in Yamaha's new series of studio monitors, the HS series, they also used a white cone driver that has basically almost nothing to do with the original Yamaha NS10 driver, but they colored it white so that people would buy them because people are used to being in a studio and seeing like a white cone, and that makes it a studio. But these are white for a reason. These are white for the same reason that the original Yamaha NS10 drivers are white. These are actually a paper cone driver on the Gauss 7s. And the nice thing about a paper cone driver, if you do them really well, is if they're treated properly, they can not only be really rigid, but also really lightweight. And a lot of modern speaker brands try to get increasing cleanliness in the low end by having increasingly rigid drivers. But as you get more and more rigid, often they get heavier and heavier. And the problem with having too heavy of a driver is it doesn't move very quickly. And speaker cones that don't move very quickly have reduced transient response, reduced transient accuracy. So the number two way in which these speakers have better low in the competition is that they are remarkably fast in the lows compared to a lot of other brands at this price point, because they have a remarkably not only stiff, but also lightweight driver. And that is what stood out to me on these guys. So who they're for, who they're not for, what's good about them compared to the competition. Just as a recap, in the article, I'll take you through it right now. In the article I did on the best studio monitors, I'll talk to you just a little bit about who made it in there, why, and how. And I'll tell you how these fit in. My top pick for people, before I heard the Gausses, were the Cali Audio LP6s for being extremely neutral in this price point of $500 and under. Really relatively balanced, flat. They're not necessarily going to be the sexiest, most dazzling speakers that are there to wow you and make you feel good about your mixes. No, they're there to be extremely neutral. And that's why they made my top pick, because they're the easiest to learn to mix on, I think, in this price range, all else being equal. But they're not for everyone. To some people, the sound will feel a little dull, a little veiled, a little unexciting. So my number two pick was the Adam Audio T5Vs, because they are really relatively flat throughout their entire range, with the exception of they have a nice little lift around 8K that gives you a little bit of additional detail in the high frequencies and helps you identify sibilants. So that little bit of additional clarity up there can help you reel in things like excessive 8K and 7K, which you'll sometimes hear on mixes. That's the area where you often find a lot of sibilants. Then, after that, for less expensive speakers, if you want to go super budget and less than $400, the PreSonus Era Studio 5, followed by the JBLs, were my top picks for super budget speakers. And then after that, I had to include some of the most popular speakers in the world, these kind of hype machines, these not flat speakers you really have to learn to mix well on because they're a little bit misleading, but they're fun. And one of them is the KRK Rocket 5, and the other one is the Yamaha HS5, which when I did the video and article, I basically told the whole world, I do not like these speakers. And now I can comfortably say that for anyone who likes something about the HS5s, or the HS8s by Yamaha, but find that they aren't well served by them because they're not leading them to great sounding mixes, I think these Gauss 7s would be an incredible alternative to them. Not only are for $500, you're getting a larger driver than the HS5, and if you want a larger driver out of Yamaha, you're now not looking at a $500 set of speakers, you're looking at an $800 set of speakers. If you want to get the Yamaha HS8s, these guys, the Gausses, not only do you get the white cone look, which is what half of people are looking for, they also give you a little bit of what people like about the Yamaha HS5 and HS8 monitors. What people like about those monitors is they are relatively bright sounding. They have this kind of boost in the upper mid-range that makes them feel clear and detailed. And that is the thing that people love about them. They sound bright, so they sound detailed, they sound like they have clarity. But the problem with that is that they tend to lead people towards mixes that sound dull and mushy because their speakers sound bright and clear. So they don't make things sound bright and clear. They sound dull, their mixes sound dull and mushy. The Gauss 7s have a little bit of that same accent that the Yamahas have, but I think they do it better. Relative to the other speakers that made my very top picks, the Kali audios and the Atom audios, these are a little bit more fun to listen to because they do have a little bit of that upper mid-range push to them that are in the Yamahas. But they do that without the low frequency roll-off that's in the Yamahas. So if you're looking at the Yamaha HS5s, you got to recognize that like under 200 hertz, they roll off. And because you're losing low frequency response, once you get them up to a level where the low frequencies feel good, it has the effect to our ear of sounding like it has a boost in the upper mid-range around 2 or 3K. Now, if you actually look at the Yamaha HS5s on a frequency analyzer, on a chart of its frequency response, you don't actually see a lift at 2 or 3K. You do see a big bump up around 1K. And then because the low frequencies are rolling off in the HS5s, they have this feeling of having a lift in the upper mid-range. These guys are different. The Gausses do not roll off as substantially as the HS5s in the lows. So you have these really clean but ample lows, cleaner lows, and more ample lows than on the Yamaha HS5s. But you also have a little bit of that lift up around 3.5, 4K, giving it a little bit of detail and clarity. And they also have a little bit of a lift up around 10K, which is, again, not a bad place to have a lift, because a lot of the times when I hear beginner and intermediate mixes, they'll have these mixes that sound kind of dark and mushy and veiled and excessively mid-rangey, except for their cymbals. And those cymbals will have like a ton of 10K on them. And it's like, why is that the only thing in the whole mix that's bright? And you have these super 10KE cymbals sticking out. Because these have ever so slightly of a lift around 10K, they're likely to steer you away from doing that. And because they have ever so slightly of a lift around 3.5K, they're likely to lead you in the direction of making your mixes less harsh. But that is balanced by actually having good low end extension. And the cool thing about the low frequencies here, I'll reiterate, the low end being the big thing on these guys, the cool thing about them is because the low end is so clean and so fast, your speakers don't fool you into thinking you have fuller, more audible bass than you really do. If you have a set of studio monitors that distort somewhat in the low frequencies and are starting to give you harmonics, you're actually getting fooled into thinking you have an audible enough kick or an audible enough bass because you have these upper harmonics in this, say, 200, 300 area. And you're hearing that stuff and thinking that you have enough bass. So you're fooled into thinking your bass is more audible when it would be more ideal if you had really clean bass, and then you had to do the things that you should do to low frequency instruments to make them speak in the mid-range. Because ultimately, the most important part of your record to get right is the mid-range. And the best way to get your kick and your bass heard properly across all systems is to have them sit right in the mid-range. So these speakers help fool you less into thinking that you have your kick and your bass speaking in the mid-range when that's just really distortion in your speaker. And I really love how fast the transient response was. So some of the details coming from a little bit of high frequency boost, but a lot more of it is coming from the driver being extremely quick because it's extremely light as well as being rigid. So those are the pros for this set of speakers. I'll go over the cons in just a second, who might not like them. But if you want a speaker that is just a little bit more bright, a little bit more fun than some of the prior top picks I had in this price range, I would definitely recommend these as possibly my favorite speakers that skew a little bit bright because of how good the bottom end is on them and how well curated the brightness is to, I think, lead you in a good direction. By amping up in that 3.5K region where often things get a little harsh, they'll encourage you to pull back in that area. And by amping up that 10K region slightly where there's often excessive sibilance or excessive cymbal shimmer in a lot of beginner and intermediate mixes. So that's my big thing here. Another thing I always like is AMT drivers. These guys have AMT drivers, also known as a ribbon tweeter, and they work a little bit differently than regular tweeters. Instead of regular dome tweeters, which are pushing air, these kind of squeeze air, almost like how I'm bringing my hands together. They kind of squeeze together and push air out that way. And they tend to, in my opinion, have really good spatialization, less of a need for a significant waveguide on a tweeter like this. So those are some of the overall benefits on these speakers. Where would I put these? Again, my absolute top pick here for speakers 500 and under, if you want them voiced with ever so slightly more clarity and detail, but not clarity and detail that is going to be harsh and annoying and mislead you and make your mixes much worse. What I compare them to is almost like an inexpensive version of the sound of PMC monitors. If you've ever heard PMC monitors, they just have such tight, clean, crisp low end that goes really deep, but without ever sounding tubby or muddy or slow. And in this price point, I think that's the closest you're getting to that kind of vibe. So for people who want really clean and accurate low end out of this price point, again, one of the better options for those factors in the low frequencies. Let me know in the comments or the chat box if you've heard these monitors, what you think of them and how you like them. Other quick thing I'll say is that right now they're on sale. These monitors are normally $500. Currently, they come with this guy, a baby RAM. They also sent me one of these. Big thanks again to RAD Distribution, Avantone for being longtime sponsors of SonicScoop. And they sent me not only speakers to try out, but they sent me this guy to try out. And this is their speaker switcher, the baby RAM. This is normally $200, but right now during the month of July, if you're checking this out as this comes out, this is totally free with the Gauss monitors. So this is basically the simplest, least expensive, high-end monitor controller there is. I'll give you the quick pitch on this. The idea here, this solves a problem that you find in almost every single monitor controller that has a volume knob at this price point. Most monitor controllers at this price point have a volume pot, a continuously variable pot. And the problem with those is that there are basically two pots stacked on top of each other, a left pot and a right pot that are moved together with the same knob. The problem with that kind of design is the design thresholds for pots that are possible to put in a inexpensive pro audio device are so bad that they can be off by as much as 10% per pot. This means that when you put two pots together, they could potentially be off by as much as 20% compared to one another. Now, people who design controllers, monitor controllers, usually try to hide that fact by putting the greatest amount of the difference near the bottom of the range of the pots. But the problem with that is, you may have experienced this on monitor controllers yourself, as you get towards the bottom of the range, the left and right image totally change. It can be pretty variable throughout the entire range, but then as you get to the bottom of the range on a conventional one, you can have the left side drop out completely before the right side does. And at different spots on your dial, you have a different stereo image. This kind of monitor controller completely changes that, because instead of having a pot, it has got a switch. And each one of the points on this switch has two resistors on it that are perfectly matched. I think the tolerances on resistors, instead of being 10%, are probably more like 0.1% or something ridiculously low, where you are never going to be apart by more than 1% or something in left, right, and probably less than that on resistors like these. So it's a monitor controller that actually sounds the same no matter where you put the dial, which is not how almost any monitor controller you've likely been using works. It's also a switcher, so it can switch between two input-output sources, two output different speakers. It's got a mono button, it's got a dim button, it's got a mute button. And this is from Heritage Audio that makes super nice high-end stuff. There are versions of this that are into the thousands, but this one is normally $200. And right now, it's free with these monitors. So it's kind of like getting $200 off of these monitors. You get them together. That's right now only during the month of July. Maybe though, I think they run that kind of deal once or maybe twice a year. So this is one of your rare chances to get that. So I'm going to go in and check out some of the comments that have come in. I'll answer some of the questions, and then we'll close it up for the day. LaRock asked, what about the Kali LP6 V2s? Those are great monitors. They are relatively flat. I would say even flatter in frequency response than the Gausses. They don't necessarily have the same cleanliness and speed and lack of distortion. Maybe if we were to compare them back to back as the Gausses, I'd need to double check measurements, but I would doubt that the driver is quite as fast or maybe quite as distortion free in the low frequencies. But the benefits the Kalis have is they're a little more flat, a little more neutral. But to some people, that sounds a little boring, a little bit veiled, and particularly people who tend to mix bright or want to hear a brighter speaker or really need more clarity out of their speaker, the Gausses are going to be a better bet. For people who are tending to mix too dark already and they need to brighten up their mixes substantially more, the Kalis might lead them a little bit more in that direction. Tyler says they are beautiful, but I need to hear them too. Yes, absolutely. You should hear monitors before you try them. I would say my personal preference, I would absolutely, if you want good looking white coned monitors, where the cones are actually white for a good reason, these guys are the ones I would go over for if you like this look over the Yamahas. I just think that they are better voiced and better designed speakers. Any other questions here? The CLA-10s, what do you think about those? I'm asking. The CLA-10s are the other ones made by Avantone. This is Gauss, made by Avantone. The Avantone CLA-10s are a remake of the NS-10, and those speakers have really no bottom end on them. Below 100 hertz, they roll off substantially, and they don't actually have a ton of super high frequency either. What they do have is a big forward bump around 1K, and they're very mid-rangey sounding speakers. But the idea there is that if you can make your mixes sound good on the Yamaha NS10s, they'll sound good just about everywhere. There's a couple of good things about the NS10s. They are a non-ported design, so they have really resonance-free low end, and the driver is able to move really quickly, in part because it's so lightweight, because it's paper, and two, because there's no port in the speaker that really helps with the transient response of the speaker. So you can really hear very accurately the attack on sounds. And that's done pretty well by this kind of driver, which is basically, when Avantone was designing this, they said, what if we took the idea of the Yamaha NS10 style of driver and then just improved it and put it into a full range speaker? And as soon as they started doing that, they kind of realized they didn't have a Yamaha NS10 anymore at all. And this thing sounds nothing like a Yamaha NS10. Just like the Yamaha HS series sounds nothing like a Yamaha NS10. What they all have in common is they do all have a little bit of a lift around 1K. But all very different speakers. A Yamaha NS10 is a speaker that sounds very not good, but encourages you to scoop things out in the middle and get your mid-range to sit properly, which again is the most important part of the mix. And I think you should have in your studio at least one set of speakers that do that, whether it's something like the Avantone CLA-10, the original Yamaha NS10, the Avantone Mix Cubes, or the original Oratone Mix Cubes. You should have a speaker in your studio that does that. But if you want an inexpensive full range speaker, absolutely one of the best bets below 500 with some of the cleanest, tightest low end under 500 and a little bit more clarity than some speakers that might, for your taste, sound too mushy and too veiled. Victoria Nova says, I usually mix bass heavy music. What type of monitors would you recommend? Thanks. If you want extreme lows, it's often a good idea to have a sub. However, it's hard to reproduce extreme lows in your studio really, really well, unless you have a really well-treated room. So that's one caveat I'll offer you. That said, adding a sub onto your system gives you a little bit of additional leeway in perfecting the low end in your room, because it gives you the option to find an ideal spot to put the low frequency driver in your space. It doesn't just have to be in your speakers, which might not be the perfect place to have low frequency emanating from in your room. So I've come to the conclusion that subs can actually help you potentially with room treatment, along with a room treatment plan. That said, there are two schools of thought on this. I do bass heavy music, so I want speakers with a lot of bass that make me really hear and feel the bass. That's one way to go. And these are not exactly those speakers. However, the problem with going that way, with the most big and fat and bass heavy sounding speakers, is that they encourage you to put less bass and low end into your mix. So sometimes having a speaker that sounds a little bit tighter and cleaner and leaner in the bass while still going deep as you want will help encourage you to push more low frequency into the mix. So if you're finding that you have mixes that aren't translating because there isn't enough low frequency in there, and your mixes come out sounding a little bit too thin and not bass heavy enough, speakers like these with cleaner, tighter lows can help you appropriately amp up the low ends even more in your system. If you have the exact opposite problem and you're loading way too much low frequency into your mix, maybe having speakers with even more bass that amp up the bass even more help, possibly, but maybe not. Because a potential problem with speakers, especially in this price range, that really seem to accent the low frequencies, is they could be doing that by having a lot of distortion in the lows. So you could be fooled into loading a bunch of 60 hertz and 100 hertz into your mix, and because there's enough distortion for that stuff to have harmonics added into the 100, 200, 300 hertz range that's more easily audible, you think you have those low-end instruments speaking clearly. But then when you take them out to the car, you find out that you can't really hear those low frequency elements. You have a ton of bass, maybe below 60 or maybe below 100, but you're still not hearing the bass instruments because you weren't encouraged to make them really speak in the mid-range, which is what's going to make things like your kick and bass speak across a variety of systems. What's going to make your bass and your kick speak well in a variety of systems is not actually getting the low end perfect on them. It's getting the mid-range right on them. And slightly cleaner, tighter, more distortion-free, tighter bass speakers like these could possibly help encourage you to do that. So those are some thoughts. Generally speaking, people who want cleaner, tighter lows that are less misleading in that way, and people who want a little bit more clarity and detail out of their speaker than a fully flat speaker, which can, to some people, can sound a little veiled and a little uninspiring to work on. My humble opinion, you want some white cone speakers for your studio and you want to spend $500 and under, these are the ones to get, not the other guys. That's my humble opinion, but that comes out of personal tastes, but also experience of coaching a lot of people on a lot of different mixes and seeing what kind of monitors do and don't work for people. I hope this one was useful for you. Check these out now. If you're checking this out in the month of July, they're $4.99 plus you get one of these for free, which is $250, which is very cool deal. I have a whole bunch of links to that stuff down below. Big thanks again to Avantone and RAD Distribution for being longtime supporters of SonicScoop. We've known those guys since, I know the guys over there since probably 2009, 2010, and they make great stuff, and they really have their ear to the ground about whenever they put something out, how is this going to be something that fills a gap that is not filled by anybody else? And they've absolutely done that with these. So I really like listening to them by popular demand. I checked them out, and now I'm going to have to add them to my roundup of the best studio monitors for 500 and under, along with some of my other favorites. Thanks for hanging out with me. This has been Justin Colletti of SonicScoop. See you next time.